This is Chapter 16, Population and Global Inequality for Social Problems. Okay, so the chapter starts out by talking about global population increase and basically how the distribution of people are around the world. And what we can see as a general pattern is that in more developed societies we have, somewhat lower populations depending on the society, and where a lot of the numbers are being increased are largely in places that are not as developed, right? So the Industrial Revolution has a lot to do with the large increase in population that happened kind of driving up towards the 1900s. So you have the Industrial Revolution takes place. The technological development produces more resources or goods, and especially when it comes to the amount of food that one can produce, right? So we had a previous boom in the same way when we hit the agricultural revolution, when people could grow more food than they could eat. But once you hit the Industrial Revolution, we have machines now that can do a lot of this stuff. So it increases yields dramatically. Another impact of this, though, too, is that with the technological increases came more investment and understanding in science and new medicines and treatments and things of this nature, which extended the human lifespan dramatically for people who had access to those remedies and those treatments or pills or whatever it ended up being eventually. So the Industrial Revolution had a big impact on how we organize society, the ways in which we produce goods. And again, as we talked about with, the chapter on the environment, as you have more and more people on the planet, all of those people have certain energy demands, right? And they're going to need food, they're going to need water, they're going to need land. And so these are really some of the kind of worries of having such a large global population, is how do we provide for everyone, right? Especially when it comes to, the context of climate change and the fact that we really need to kind of cut back on a lot of our energy consumption, especially when it relates to fossil fuels like coal, right? But obviously it gets more complicated because there are many areas around the globe that just aren't as developed, that for them to develop, they're going to use those industries so that people could have access to a lot of the resources that are taken for granted in industrialized nations. So anyway, the Industrial Revolution really is a kind of tipping point towards just a whole bunch of people on the planet. So when we look at global increases today, most of the 83 million people being added to the world every year live in poor countries. And this is a problem because poor countries are already facing issues of poverty. So more people being born into poverty, that's a very, grave concern. So when the United Nations predicts what global populations will be in the future, they predict that by 2025, the global population will surpass 8 billion people. And by 2050, that it would climb to about 10 billion people. So if you think about that, getting enough clean water resources for everyone, food, shelter, again, energy, and in a world where we're already dealing with a lot of droughts and more severe storms and, some of these things that impact whether or not we can have enough crops or we can provide everything for everyone. So we're going to talk about some of the different theories that deal with these population increases. Okay, so before we can really even understand it, I don't know why they lead with the other stuff before they lead with this one in the book, but I'm just trying to go with the book. But anyway, how do we understand what changes there are in the population? Well, that's demography, right? So this is kind of like a part of sociological study, often done in a quantitative fashion, right? Studying the human population. So basically trying to understand what has changed, is it growing, is it shrinking, and the kind of general patterns in the population. So a couple of the ways that they measure population increases or decreases is through looking at fertility rates and mortality rates, meaning how many people are born is fertility, and how many people die is mortality. So if you have large population growth, that means you have people that are high fertility, meaning having a lot of children, right? And low mortality, meaning living much longer and not dying until they're in old age, right? And that's going to produce large population increases. So we're going to talk about how these things kind of change a little bit depending on development, or at least how the different theories look at it that way. But a more accurate measure is what they call the infant mortality rate. So the infant mortality rate is the number of babies of every 1,000 babies who are born who end up dying before their first birthday. And this is a pretty good measure to give us an idea about the health and the welfare of the people within a particular, population. And like something that was cited in the film Sicko from 2007, so those numbers might have changed, but that a baby born in El Salvador has a lower infant mortality rate than a baby born in Detroit. So even when we look at mortality rates, especially when it comes to infant mortality, like by country, that only tells us a little bit, right? When you look within a country, you can also see inequities that are represented that way. So why is it that Detroit would have such a high infant mortality rate? Well, again, it's related to poverty. And it's related to gaining access to healthcare resources. We live in a country that doesn't provide universal healthcare or any sort of, free or affordable healthcare for a lot of people. So that means they're not going to seek out prenatal care because it's very expensive. And so without less prenatal care and support, and also, again, healthy communities, access to food and not living in food deserts, all sorts of other factors, right? But specifically, the healthcare access thing, really, the cost of it is what keeps a lot of people away from, reaching out for services that could really help them, and that could negatively impact their children, right? We look at just even birth weight of babies. We can see that that is, statistically significantly different by race and ethnicity in this country. So even, by the state in which you live, it's still going to matter what's your race or ethnicity into what's your likelihood of your child surviving, right? This is a cause for concern for sociologists, right? We want people to have equity when it comes to health outcomes. Okay, so again, how do we measure all this stuff? So demographers can calculate society's natural growth rate, or basically combining the fertility rates and the mortality rates. So how many people are born, how many people are dying, and that's kind of that crude, natural growth rate. And an annual growth rate can be used to calculate, the doubling time for a nation's population. So to kind of get an idea of like how long until that population increases dramatically. So there's different ways to understand this, right? So there's what they call the low growth north. There's the high growth south, right? And really what this means is it's kind of about the level of reproduction that's happening within that society. So a low growth north, right, this kind of concept is that there's often zero population growth in some nations within the north, largely high income nations like the US. Population increase is not a serious problem like it is in other places. Okay, so why is that? Because it costs a lot of money to have kids, right? And biggest one, like I said, if there's like one thing I hope that you take away from this, it's that if you don't give women contraception or basically control over their own body, choice as to whether or not they have children, then they're going to end up having a bunch of kids. And so we also see this. There's been many attacks against Roe v. Wade in recent years, many state laws putting in basically effectively abortion bans that make it so that women, the more privileged of which can travel to other states, hopefully, to gain access to medical resources. But for many of those who can't, and of course already the cost of it itself was very expensive, this means we're going to have a huge uptake in population, largely from people in poverty in the United States that, can't gain access to these medical resources, even though it's legally a right within our country. So anyway, we can see that that's a really, really strong predictor, is you give women the power to control their bodies, and guess what? They're not going to have 11 kids, right? But when we look at places like the high growth South, we see that, the medical technology that has basically helped reduce death rates has not reduced population increase. Again, so basically what you have in the high growth South is that a lot of people are having kids, but people are living longer and not dying as easily as they did, from, the kind of mortality of the past. And so the social standing of women has everything to do with this. most population experts agree that the key element in controlling the world population growth is raising the standard of women, the rights of women, and making birth control technology much more widely available. That's essential, right? But population will increase as long as a culture defines a woman's responsibility as raising children. So we have to really factor in, how our social values guide some of these larger social issues that we deal with in the culture, right? So if you see a woman as basically a walking womb that shouldn't have rights, as some people do in like Texas and other states that have enacted these abortion bans, then you reduce women to, motherhood. And by not allowing them to have access to birth control, they can't family plan. This is something that people don't talk about a lot because abortion is so stigmatized in our culture. But estimates are about 1 to 2/3 of women that are accessing an abortion already have children. So this idea that, women are just flippantly having abortions, it's just not true, right? It's actually really interesting when you look at culture and abortion, and in other places around the world, these things mean different things, but it largely is connected to kind of a religious or theological understanding, right? But it is kind of fascinating just to see how much something that's, a medical procedure can be either stigmatized, can be either non-stigmatized, or just kind of normative. And at least within our culture, it's much less stigmatized to use birth control or contraceptives. And a lot of people can't gain access to those things as well because of the medical system in which we live in, right? That the Supreme Court allows certain state institutions and universities and different, organizations to basically, even though Obamacare expanded access to contraceptives for women and birth control access, some of those Supreme Court rulings basically say that, certain companies or like religious colleges or things like that are exempt from having to provide those things to their employees. So there's always been this undercutting of it within our country, and this is very problematic in a world where rising global population means more energy, more food, more water, and, more of the kind of consequences that come from that, right? So anyway, we have to raise the social standing of women and consider them people beyond their reproductive capacities. So when we look at population, there's two kind of main ways to look at it. You got Malthusian theory, and then you got demographic transition theory. So Malthusian theory was basically saying that population increases geometrically while food increases arithmetically. And you're like, oh, okay, well that makes sense. Okay, so let me explain that a little bit better. Basically, like, what he's trying to say is like, how many plants you plant in the ground is roughly how many you will get, right? Versus each person can have X amount of people. So it's like, at the time, again, you got to give it to like the time period in which the theory was produced. So this Malthus dude was coming up with this theory in a time period of the Industrial Revolution when he saw all of these like huge increases in population. And so he basically thought that we're going to get to the place beyond what the planet can feed, right? Leading to starvation and social chaos, like society will break down because there's not going to be enough stuff to support all the people on the planet, right? So, like every good dystopian novel basically is based on this, right? Or a lot of the great dystopian films, which, Tank Girl, Waterworld, all that kind of fun stuff. So anyway, basically though, Malthus, he was looking at it within the context of his time period, so that's important too, right? At his time period, everyone was having like 12 kids. So if you think of it that way, like if one couple has 12 kids, and their 12 kids have 12 kids, and then their 12 kids have 12 kids, you got way too many damn people, right? That's a family reunion you don't want to go to, right? Which is actually funny. My husband's family is like that on one side. He has 76 first cousins on one side of his family. That's too many people, right? At least to me, I'm like, I think on that same, like on my matrilineal side of my family, I think I have like 7 cousins. He has 76. It's like, that's too many people. Anyway, that's just me. So, the idea though is that there's going to be too many people, the sky is falling, we're all going to die, there's not going to be enough food, right? Which is kind of fair in the fact that you can only plant so much food, but people can just keep reproducing, right? So Malthus had some points to this, and we have kind of what we call now neo-Malthusian theory, like people that kind of adapted it beyond what he was talking about in that Industrial Revolution time period. But a big kind of caveat to Malthus is let women control their bodies and they won't have 11 children. That's step one, right? Also, when we talk about not having enough food to feed everybody, leading to starvation, there's a lot of people that starve all over the world today, and that's been the case for many, many years. But in the US, we throw away about 40% of the food that we grow. A lot of the produce that's grown in the US doesn't get to the shelf because it's ugly. Oh, that carrot looks weird, so throw it away. Sometimes they even throw away produce that's perfectly good just to control prices, meaning they grew too much spinach this year, so the overall price of spinach will drop, and that won't make it worth their investment. So they throw away a bunch of spinach to raise the price of spinach so they can sell that spinach. This is just one of the many problems with capitalism, right? Is that when we use capitalism to control our education, our food system, all of these other kind of like our healthcare, there's a lot of consequences to that because the profit motive goes against the kind of egalitarian, like let's grow enough food so everyone can eat, is a very different model than capitalism, which is you will eat if you have money. So, if there's no money in feeding the poor people around the world, there's no money in ending starvation for countries that are, facing famines and all sorts of stuff like that, then they're not going to do it, right? So that's kind of part of the issue with capitalism as it is. Anywho, let's go into demographic transition theory. So this theory basically says that how developed a society is, right? Or like basically their level of technological development is linked to the demographic changes within that country. Right? So they basically said in pre-industrial agrarian societies, so basically pretty much all of human society before 1750s, this is stage one, right? So again, I should have said demographic transition theory has 4 stages to it. So stage one is societies that have high birth rates because families depend on the labor of children and there's no birth control, right? So people have a bunch of kids because the kids aren't going to school. You're not paying 60 grand per kid for them to go to college. You're putting them in the field to work with you, right? And then once you get to stage 2, this is the onset of industrialization, and this begins the demographic transition. In stage 3, you get to a mature industrial economy. So this means the birth rate starts to fall in line with the death rate, and the rate of population increase slows. And in stage 4, this corresponds to a post-industrial economy, like the one in the United States, which promotes stable population sizes once again. So basically, Malthus is like, there's too many damn people, we're all going to die. Demographic transition theory says, hey, if we just provide people with birth control and better technologies, then they're going to, the mortality rates may still fall, meaning less people are dying, people are living for longer. But the birth rates will also fall because people have choice whether they have children or not, if they have access to birth control. And as children are no longer a commodity to help us pick, food from the farm or whatever it might have been, not using children as labor also affects, the kind of drive to have them. So anyway, that's the demographic transition theory, basically arguing that there are ways to deal with these population increases, but because of the history of the Industrial Revolution that really gave resources and power to very few Western countries that then use that power to extract the wealth and really limit the development of other countries around the world, that this is so unequally distributed. Again, that low growth north, right? In those spaces, you have very few people having 12, 15, 20 kids, right? Versus in the high growth south, in places where, again, there's just no access to birth control. Women are often married, in some societies, women are married off to older men at 12 to 14 years old and start having children immediately once they can. And they do that for 20 years. So again, because their only commodity in the society is as parent, is as mother. Women don't have rights. They don't have access to education or to the labor market to do something else, right? And so that's part of the industrialization as well. And producing a mature industrial economy provides more jobs and resources that are, differ from just being reproductive. Okay, so moving on to other issues with global inequality. So when demographers are trying to understand global inequality, they will often make these graphic representations that help us understand how that population is distributed, or how demographically the population is distributed. They call them population pyramids, right? So basically, population pyramids are just graphs that show the distribution of ages across a population, divided down the center between male and female members of the population. So it kind of gives you an idea of like, are there a bunch of old people, a bunch of young people? The shape of the pyramid gives you an idea about, basically the overall population. So there's different stages of population pyramids. So meaning some are, high fluctuating, some are, early expanding, late expanding. That part you don't need to know as much. It's just about how they are kind of a visual representation of the difference of these populations demographically across the world. Okay, so then looking at hunger, this is a big issue when it comes to places where we have a lot of world poverty, right? So the world's income and wealth is very, very unevenly distributed. And so, even the kind of plight that people go through in these places where they have such, systemic poverty is beyond what people in, westernized developed countries can even understand. Like just not even having access to water, not having access to just basic food. This is very different than the experiences in more high-income nations. So hunger is an issue that does still happen to people in those Western societies in some fashions, but largely, with some access to some sorts of welfare services or, especially in Europe more so than in the United States, because that was kind of politically targeted in the 1990s and really, really scaled down in the United States. But, obviously, when you look at the poverty within this country compared to places around the world that are undeveloped, I mean, it's like comparing apples to oranges, right? When it comes to hunger, there's places that are dealing with these long set famines that, destroy entire populations. So it's something that is an issue theoretically that does really happen across the world, but when you look at the concentration of hunger, it's so much more within those countries that lack resources. So high-income nations are typically the ones that contain all of those, kind of developed societies. They're rich, they have high productivity that comes from having advanced technology. Middle-income nations are typically people who have incomes ranging from about $3,500 to about $15,000 a year. So a couple tiny places in Europe, but mostly we're talking more about Latin America, some places in Asia, some places in Africa. And then low-income nations are on average very agrarian and poor. So most of those nations are found in Central Africa or Asia. And these are, again, places that were used extractively for wealth, especially in, Central Africa. So they haven't really been able to develop their own technologies and infrastructures and things like this. And again, because capitalism isn't about charity, it's not about helping people develop, because why would you help people develop? Then they could sell all of those resources at a higher markup, right? Versus now, a lot of the stuff we use for like laptops and other kinds of computers, phones, all that kind of stuff comes from mining within a lot of these Central African countries that causes all sorts of pollution and devastation. But also, it's a profit to these corporations to be able to, work within a world system where people are very desperate and poor, so they don't have to pay them for those resources, at least fairly, like they would if that was coming from another developed nation. Okay, so the world's poverty problem is widespread, right? it's so much, around the world. About, what was it in the book? I think they had their estimate, and again, the figures are just about 2 years old at this point. Around the world, about 767 million people do not have enough food to eat. And it's important to distinguish absolute poverty from relative poverty when we talk about poverty. So poverty is, no matter what kind of poverty you're in, it causes physiological problems, stress problems, all sorts of consequences. But absolute poverty is when you have nothing, right? So that's basically a lack of resources that's life-threatening. So not having enough food to eat, not having water, not having clothing, not having shelter, right? We do have some aspects of absolute poverty. We can think about, some, especially like very endemic homeless populations, right, in developed nations. But overwhelmingly, the kind of poverty that we have in developed nations is what's called relative poverty, which means that you lack resources, but you still have that access to a lot of resources that people take for granted. Like, if you're homeless in the United States, there's a lot of places and ways in which you can get fresh and clean water, right, for relatively cheap. Versus, there's many people around the world that just don't have access to water at all, right? Or if they do, they have to basically go through a lot to get it, or the access to the resources they do have are very polluted and contaminated. So basically, we benefit from the development of society. So for instance, you can go into a bathroom and you flush the toilet and like someone handles what happens there, right? Meaning there's water systems that clean the water so that a lot of those kind of waterborne illnesses that happen in a lot of other countries are just not plaguing us in the same way here. So, again, having kind of industrialized these ideas that you have people go around and spray for mosquitoes so that those don't become, vector organisms for spreading other diseases, or, so that's why we see like malaria rates are much, much, much higher in some areas than others, because again, some of it has to do with the infrastructure itself. So that kind of lends into relative versus absolute poverty, is that in the US, we take a lot of stuff for granted that would not be taken for granted in other countries. Like having fresh water to flush your toilet is kind of wild when you think about it, when there's people around the world that they have to travel like hours a day to go to a well to be able to fill up just enough water to use for that one day and then have to do it all over again. So for them to have water, the idea of having water in their own house, which most of them are not living in housing per se, in the kind of way we think of it, just the idea of having that fresh water and then just throwing it away like that is very just anathema to a lot of folks. So it's interesting how, again, our lifestyles really dictate our belief systems, and the belief systems really shape what kind of lifestyles we end up having. When I'm looking at poverty in children, about 1/5 of all children lack the nutrition that's needed for good health. That's a huge problem, right? Because you have some of the consequences of not getting nutrition at a young age can affect your brain development and overall development, which of course is going to affect the future, right? We have future generations of folks that either those kids are just not going to make it, or if they do, they're going to have a lot more, health issues. And, again, we need to make sure that the youngest of us, the most vulnerable of us, children, are able to be supported, because we know it's not from their lack of anything. It's not like, well, go get a job, child, right? As to why there's child poverty. This is something that's really interesting, how controversial it becomes in the United States. Like, it's very political, this idea of giving children free lunches or free breakfast programs or things like that, when we know that kids can't perform in school when they're hungry. You just can't focus on what you need to focus on. So how can you be successful in our society if you can't get an education, and if you can't get that education just because you can't focus because you're hungry, right? So we already know there's inequities in our system, but when we look at this globally, we can see the inequities are just expand dramatically. When looking at poverty in women in poor countries, men and women are even more unequal than they are here in the US. And because traditional societies are very, very strongly patriarchal, right? This idea that women are second class, that men have the power, men make the decisions. This means women have very few choices, right? They're not receiving education in a lot of situations, or if they do, they only receive schooling for just the first couple years, right? They like basically like through parts of elementary school, but once they would get to junior high or high school, it's like, what's the point of educating them if they're just going to be making babies, right? So as a result of not being educated, there's no economic opportunities, because if you don't have an education, you can't get a good job, right? You need training and skills for those things. So it's kind of like a cyclical loop. By denying women access to those things, it creates a situation where then they can't be productive in that labor market. And it's kind of, startling. There's this great documentary called Half the Sky, and in it, it looks at all of these issues of, the women face around the world. But one of them, they talk about this program called Room to Read, and they were going to Vietnam, and they operate around the world. But basically, in this film, they focus on the education of Vietnamese girls, and how, again, by the time they reach, those kind of young, maybe like 9, 10, 11, often they're being asked to stay home to take care of younger siblings or help support the family in that way. Because they're considered that they're not going to be able to be economically supportive. So this Room to Read program was basically trying to help support those poor families so that they can afford to send their child to school and give her the resources she needs so she can survive, and thrive in education. And it's really transformational, and it was a beautiful part of the documentary to look at how these girls who, when they first started, they were kind of like, well, what's the point, but then once they realized their potential, and once they realized like they could go to a university, they could, be productive and help support their families and help lift their families out of dire poverty. It's a really transformational, beautiful experience. And, watching that part of the film, and I think that's something that a lot of these cultures, because of the extreme patriarchy, they can't see the power that women have. Meaning, instead of having, just men in the economic market, you expand those opportunities to women as well. This actually improves the economic situation of the entire country, right? And it takes a lot of the stress and pressure off men to be the sole provider. So anywho, that's just an interesting kind of, again, another feedback loop of, women shouldn't be educated because they're not going to do anything with that education, becomes the kind of sentence, and it just stays that way. So it's, interesting to see groups like Room to Read bring in a lot of money from other countries to try to help support, those educational efforts for women in areas where they're just not being educated. It's not considered a priority. And then slavery is another, huge issue around the world. There's different types of slavery that exist. There is just, the chattel slavery that we're kind of familiar with, where you buy and sell people against, it's obviously against the law everywhere, but it still happens. Very famously in the fishing trade in some areas around the world, where people are, basically forced labor in these markets. It seems like it's something in history that it's gone, but actually there's a lot of people being enslaved right now all around the world. Sometimes people can be enslaved by the state, meaning basically the government can force people to perform labor as punishment for criminal violations because the state needs workers. Good example of that is in the United States, right? We know that slavery was outlawed, right? Yeah, the Emancipation Proclamation, all this stuff. So the 13th Amendment basically says you can't have slavery, but it has a big asterisk in it that says you can't have slavery unless it's as punishment for a crime. So this is why we have the kind of prison labor system that we do, right? Like in California, we'll make incarcerated folks fight on the front lines of fires, often getting paid only $1 or so an hour to work 12-hour shifts where they're on the front lines of fighting fires, because it saves the state of California millions of dollars not having to pay fully trained firefighters to do it. So here's the worst part of it though. When someone is then released from their incarceration, right? And so basically, let's say for 6 months you've been working as a firefighter while you were incarcerated, making $1 an hour, and you're released. So you're like, hey, you know what? I know how to be a firefighter now because I was trained, so why don't I go do that? And then they won't let you because you have a felony. So that's, one exploitive example of how we use a lot of kind of And again, some people could say, well, it's not forced labor in the same way. It's like, but it kind of is, because if you're incentivizing release, like you say, hey, if you do this, you can get a slightly shorter term in jail. That's like an offer you can't refuse, right? Many corporations around the United States use prison labor because it's so cheap. Like the whole Idaho potatoes, all of that stuff. It's all grown in prison yards. Like, people don't understand the reality of this stuff. And that's why, because they hide it from you, because if you knew, you'd be outraged, right? But most people don't know because, again, they don't want you to know this stuff as much. So then a third way that servitude or slavery happens around the world is child slavery. So oftentimes, people that are in real desperate economic situations, they can either sell their children into slavery or, just to cover the cost of their debts, or sometimes, marry them off at a young age. Again, that's the fifth type. Let me not skip there first. So the third type is basically, again, poor families are just trying to bring in income, so they'll sell their children. For example, one of my best friends growing up, high school, early college, all of it, her mom was from the Philippines, and her mother was sold into a brothel by her family. And my friend, did not get that, because again, she grew up in America and whatever, but her mom still sent remittances back home, and so basically, like, money to help support a family there. And so my friend is like, how can you do that? Like, they sold you into a brothel. And she's like, well, that's my belief system. I believe that I should support my family if I have the opportunity to. Like, she doesn't have like she's not pissed about it or anything like that. And the reason she was sold was so that her parents could pay for her brothers to go to school. Right? So that's pretty horrific. Actually, she met my friend's dad working in that brothel, when he was stationed there during Vietnam. So anyway, you don't need to know all of that. But basically, that's just one example of, like, sometimes this happens. And again, that same film, Half the Sky, they look at issues of this in India, in Bangladesh, and other areas where, sometimes children are sold into slavery. And this can either be what's called debt bondage, where you're enslaved, basically because... okay, so this is a complicated one. So they basically manipulate a lot of people into this slavery, right? You're broke, and they say, hey, I have a job opportunity for you. You're going to go be a housekeeper for this person, right? But then, like, they bring people, and this is also, again, people are enslaved right now in the United States. Like, that's the real headline I should have left with it there. A lot of people in domestic situations, and then, of course, in sex trafficking, right? So in domestic situations, you have people that are live-in housekeepers, live-in nannies, that are working 20 hours a day, not being fairly compensated, sometimes being physically abused by the people they lived with. And the people who bring them here, they owe that debt, meaning it costs money to transport a person from one country to another. And if you're in dire poverty, you basically sign this contract saying, yes, I will pay you back for the debt of sending me here, right? But what happens is the employers basically enslave these workers, and they pay them too little to ever cover the cost of their debt. So they're never able to actually break free of that servitude, and they just become locked in that system. And then the fifth one that I kind of skipped to a little bit before is, servile forms of marriage. Basically, there's a lot of places around the world where children are sold or given to people at very young ages to be brides. And so being a child bride, yeah, that's what that is. You're now property. You're no longer a person. And so this is a huge problem that's still happening around the world, and it's connected to the United States and our own value systems as well, as we bring in domestic laborers to do work that people don't have time because of the industrial economy to do, like, clean your house, take care of your kids, all that wealthy people stuff. You also have a lot of people, again, in sex trafficking, people that are here that are forced to perform acts, so that someone can make money off of their bodies. You have people that are working in industries, not just domestic work, but like the garment factory district in Los Angeles. You have a ton of people that are undocumented or through some of these kind of very shady ways, but they're paid exploitive wages so that they can't kind of get themselves out of those situations. So this is something we tend to think of like as the past, and no one wants to talk about it because it's horrible. It's horrific, right? But we have to, or we're never going to move forward. Okay, so how do we apply different theories to what we see in these, facts around the world? So structural functional analysis is always looking at the process of modernization and looking at how, people throughout the world were very poor until the Industrial Revolution, because that started to raise living standards. And so although some nations are more productive than others, all nations today are better off compared to a century ago as far as like modernization, right? So meaning like better access to water, technologies, better access to medicines, things like that. But again, you could really argue that's not 100% the case when it comes to a lot of places that are financially strapped around the world. So modernization theory is basically a model of economic and social development that explains global inequality in terms of, again, those technological differences, as well as the cultural differences that exist between societies. So you have W.W. Rostow's Stages of Modernization, which is similar to demographic transition, but not quite, right? So first, he calls it, the first stage is the traditional stage, where people living in traditional agrarian societies raise their children to look at the past, respecting old ways. So if you think of it this way, demographic transition theory is looking at the societal structure of an industry. The stages of modernization theory is much more looking at the cultural stages, if that makes sense, right? So again, traditional stage, people live in agrarian societies, you're raising crops or livestock, things like that. You teach your kids to respect the ways that people have had for many, many generations. Then you have a takeoff stage, where society starts to break free of that cultural tradition, and they allow people to develop their talents and imagination to pursue new types of work. So that's kind of like the Industrial Revolution comes in, and there's new types of work and opportunities. Then the third stage of this is a drive to technological maturity. So people become, much more technologically advanced, which means they can understand more about what's going on in their societies, right? The more research we can do, the more we can understand it. So they start to see technological progress and economic growth as solutions to issues like poverty or access to, health or any of these kind of things. And then the last stage is where we're at, is high mass consumption. So basically, industrial technology is widespread, the economy is rapidly grown, and the living standards have gone up, and now people are just, basically high on the hog, fat and happy, using way too much consumption. Okay, so that's actually a good transition into social conflict analysis. So social conflict theory is really looking at the global economic system and its equity. So people around the world were roughly equal until the beginning of colonialism. So colonialism was that system of economic exploitation that really made some nations rich and other nations poor. And not by accident, the rich nations kept those other countries poor so that they could then become rich. Right? Colonization of going to a place, putting a flag on the land, and stealing everyone's gold or other resources to make yourself rich. So world systems theory is a model of economic development that explains global inequality in terms of the historical exploitation of poor societies by rich ones. So colonialism, again, is that process by which some nations are enriching themselves through economic control of other nations, but also through political control of other nations. Colonialism created inequality, and the world's capitalistic system that's now dominated by multinational corporations continues to enrich some nations at the extreme expense of others. So neocolonialism is a new form of economic exploitation, right? So this involves the operation of multinational corporations rather than direct political control by foreign governments. So neocolonialism, instead of it being like, the English go to India and colonize it, this is like Apple goes to China and colonizes it, right? You have like Coca-Cola all over the world, or what we call transnational corporations, right? That they operate and distribute from everywhere around the globe. And so now, because these multinational corporations are so wealthy and so powerful, they can actually change some of the political issues or some of the economic structures. So meaning they can convince certain governments to like waive environmental regulations or oversight, to, provide them with, basically they're able to motivate, saying, hey, we're going to bring all this money and this jobs, so let us, like, what was the one? I can't remember, the water company where they were just basically taking water from the Ganges River because they had some agreement. And you're like, that's the river that, like, they float dead people in. And they were, like, turning it into bottled water that people drink here. Anyway, it's kind of funny when you think about it because you're like, man, people do not realize they're drinking, like, corpse water. Anywho, so neocolonialism is kind of our newer version of how this is operating today. We have to look past just the governments themselves and look at how the corporations, being so powerful, some of them have much more money than the GDP of entire nations. How are they putting their thumb on the scale? And then you have Immanuel Wallerstein's, ideas of a capitalist world economy. So he basically says that if you're drawn into the world economy by colonial exploitation and you're a poor nation, this is going to make it so you have to continue to support the rich nations, because you're providing, by being a poor nation, you're providing a rich nation inexpensive labor sources, vast markets for industrial products, and, a lot of those corporations, some of them are based in Western societies, like, like Apple or something, right? When you look at someone like Apple as a company, and I say someone because, like, in our country, corporations are people, which is so dumb. It's so dumb. But anyway, they are, I guess, even though they can't, like, breathe or die or go to jail. So corporations, basically, they're based in rich countries. So some of the benefits, if there are any that are coming back to any sort of municipality or government, it's going to be to those areas, right? And definitely not to those countries that are being exploited so that these companies can make more money, right? So, like, paying people in Bangladesh less than 35 cents an hour to make, all the clothes that go into our major department stores. That's one example, right? So Wallerstein is basically saying that this creates this kind of dependency, right? Where dependency can really kind of occur in three different ways in his argument. The poor countries have only narrow export-oriented economies. And so largely this is the fact that, the second reason, because they don't have industrial production. So they're easier to control, right? They only have so many things that they can export, so that really doesn't help them economically. And also, that means they're really relying on importing a lot of stuff. So they need good relationships with those other economies. And poor countries are deeply in debt. So from this point of view, the problem of global population increase is obviously going to continue because many of the world's nations are going to remain poor so that they can be exploited by rich nations. And so, as we talked about, if the most, people are very poor and they aren't industrialized nations, they don't have access to birth control and contraceptives and whatever, again, then their fertility rates are going to remain high. Okay, so how do different political viewpoints in our country understand or look at this issue? So conservatives always say, look to the power of the market. On average, the world's people live longer and healthier lives than those of their ancestors several centuries ago. Still, about 1 billion of the world's people remain poor, though. Right? So conservatives support allowing the production or the productive power of the market to raise the living standards of poor nations, because that's kind of what's happened, in the past, was encouraging capital investment in technology can lift the economic situation of poor nations, right? But again, capitalism is not charity. Unless those nations have something that rich nations want, they're not going to get that development. So liberals say the government must act, right? Liberals, that's like literally the definition of what liberal means, is changing within the system. So liberals say that the government has to do something. That most people in rich nations have much more than they need. But 1 billion people around the world, don't have enough food to eat, don't have housing, don't have education. So liberals believe that the rich of the world should share some of their wealth in the form of foreign aid that could help improve health, schooling, and housing. They also oppose sweatshops and support land reform. So again, with sweatshop labor, this is a huge problem the exploitation it causes, but really it's so that transnational corporations can make so much money off of the backs of paying people so little. Goes back to what we talked about way back in the day about surplus value. If you pay someone, $5 an hour instead of $15 an hour, the boss makes that much more off of you. So, basically liberals are saying that if the rich would give back, then they could alleviate some of these things. One example being Elon Musk buying Twitter. Ooh, Elon Musk. Everyone loves this guy, which is so weird to me. I'm like, did you love Lex Luthor? I don't understand it. But anyway, so this dude, he says cockily years ago to the UN, hey, tell me how much money it is to end global poverty or end global hunger, I believe it was. And he's like, and I'll do it. And they're like, okay, here's a way to do it. And I believe it was like 10 to 15 or less than $20 billion. I can't remember the specifics. Sorry. I'm not trying to hose you here. I'm tired and I can't remember the specifics. Anywho, the important part of it is that he bought Twitter for roughly double that. When the UN finally came to him with the report and said, hey, here's how much it would cost, he said, okay, that's cool. And then, of course, didn't do it, obviously, right? It's just a nice selling point to say, oh, I care about people, but I'm also the richest person in the history of the entire world. And maybe you got to look at the facts. Like, it's that whole thing. Sociologists, we don't look at, we do, of course, right? People are data, but you can't just look at what people say. You got to look at what they do. What are their actions, right? So, yeah, this idea like, oh, maybe if rich people just helped out. It's like the amount of wealth they have is incredibly staggering. The kind of just fun things they do, like, I'll just buy Twitter, or I'll just send ships into space for no reason, just for fun. Not for like scientific discovery or understand things or to, I don't know, alleviate climate change. It's going to make us all burn. But so they can like terraform another planet and move there and live there and then ruin that planet. It's just fascinating to me. The whole thing is fascinating. Especially as a sociologist nowadays, it's like, what? Like, it's an important tool, this discipline, to try and understand the world around us as it rapidly changes. Right? But again, this idea is like, maybe if someone like Elon Musk wasn't able to circumvent the system and not pay taxes, like Jeff Bezos is the same thing, then if they actually had to have a commensurate tax rate that's similar to like middle class people, then we would have plenty of money in our system to pay for healthcare of everybody, education of everybody, make sure no one is, starving and things like that. And that goes for around the globe. Right? But we somehow are in this time in human history where we think it's okay for a handful of people to have more money than entire governments. It's not going to end well. Anyway, that's my take. Okay, so then great transition into the radical left. So the radical left is saying we got to get rid of global capitalism, right? That some of the world's is very overdeveloped. And a lot of the world is also very underdeveloped. So the world's wealth is concentrated in a handful of very rich nations, and at this point, in a handful of very rich people within those rich nations. So the radical left supports replacing capitalist world economies with systems that value people over profits. Meaning, we're in a situation where soon the entire world will burn because we care more about the money than we care about whether or not people live, or like whether our children or our children's children have a home to live on, right? Have food to eat, have air to breathe, those kind of things. So they say, let's eliminate multinational corporations. Let's get rid of them. Let's do global stuff, meaning let's use the land that has been really taken from us by these corporations. Let's use that for local consumption, meaning instead of having your produce get, basically like grown in South America, put on a plane, then put on a truck, then go through all these different warehouses to get to the shelf that you eat, why don't you just put a farm down the street and you go to your local farm like people did for most of human civilization, right? So much of the plight of the world that we've caused, especially this economic, not just economic, but really the environmental damage as a result of these wide-scale industrial processes that we take for granted for our convenience in wealthy nations, right? So they're saying the convenience isn't worth everyone dying. We should care more about how we're polluting, how we're harming folks, and put the interests of people over profits, right? And part of that includes canceling foreign debt so that countries aren't put in a situation like the IMF and World Bank. We don't have time to get into how much they exploit people. Well, and by people, I mean countries. But basically, they kind of force low-income countries into these situations where they have to agree to these, basically contingency plans, or these debt that they take on from these wealthy countries in order to get any of that industrialization. Like I said, capitalism is not charity. So if those poor countries want that, industrial technology, they have to agree to be in these long-standing debts to these other, wealthy countries or sometimes multinational corporations, that makes it very, very impossible to ever get out from under those debts. So anyway, that's kind of what radicals are saying is, let's get rid of all the bad stuff. Let's get rid of the stuff that's like burning the earth, hurting the people, causing a lot of this poverty, and canceling that foreign debt that basically makes poor countries be under the thumb of rich countries, right? So anyway, very different takes on what to do, right? Conservatives are like, hey, let the market decide. The liberals are like, hey, the government's got to do something to get people to not be such jerks. And the radical left is saying, that's not going to work. You got to just end the whole system of global capitalism. Because as soon as there's an economic advantage to not helping people, you're not going to help people, right? So anyway, very different takes. But as sociologists, we're really trying to understand how a particular society's organization and the ways in which the cultural values of that, particular society connect really can shape the entire, structure of that system. So in wealthy nations, because we're not dealing with a lot of the issues of poverty that are happening in those other nations, we just don't even care. We don't even think about it. We don't realize that all the clothes we wear, we get through sweatshop labor that's incredibly exploitive, and not just that, but toxic to the environment. Especially the whole industry of fast fashion. Oh God, why am I still talking about that? Anyway, let me wrap that up for today and say that's about enough on this edition of Social Problems. But what I want you to just take away though is that sociology can be an important tool for understanding and looking beyond some of our assumptions and our expectations and really trying to see all of the factors that underlie those things.